component life cycle hooks. So we will start understanding about the life cycle. So last session we discussed about custom events, how to deal with the custom events, how do we manage the custom events. One simple example we learned. Now another very important concept, so we need to understand, is about how we can deal with the component life cycle. So we need to understand about the component life cycle. Actually, we call this as hooking into component life cycle. Generally, every component that we created, so every component undergoes various phases. Actually, our entire application have a cycle. Our entire application have a life cycle. Means application cycle will be there. Angular applications will undergo various phases actually. Different phases will be there. That I will explain towards the end. Angular application cycle, how it actually works. In the Angular application cycle, we will have a component cycle. That means, for example, I will just tell you the basic point. So we have a static DOM. So we have the static DOM. So this static DOM, that means first let me give you a simple point. Like here we are having a HTML page. So we are having an HTML page. So HTML page. So this HTML page is actually, HTML page is your index.html. Index.html. That is your HTML page. So this page first loads into browser. So this HTML page loads into browser. That will load into browser. So this is generally, suppose I say this is browser. HTML page loads into browser. HTML page is our index.html page that loads into the browser. So actually it loads into browser and it loads the static DOM. It loads the static DOM, document object model. So it loads the static DOM. Usually the static DOM is loaded. The static DOM is loaded on an event called DOM content loaded. This static DOM is loaded on an event called DOM content loaded. DOM content loaded. It is loaded on an event called DOM content loaded. So usually, yeah. So this is DOM content loaded is an event. On that event, so the browser loads. So the static DOM. That is the general thing. So that means on this DOM content loaded event, on this event, the page is loaded into browser actually. on that event, the page is loaded into browser. So that is what actually the static DOM. The static DOM is loaded into browser. On DOM content loaded event that you can see regularly. So on this event, the page is loaded, static DOM is loaded into browser. Actually, this is browser related event. So this is an browser event actually. DOM content loaded is an browser event actually. Browser event. On this event, it loads the static DOM into memory. It loads the static DOM into memory. So every time, first it loads that static DOM into memory. For example, so this is our project. So project is equal to Amazon. When we first start the project, the first page that comes is index page. So the page is loaded into that browser actually. After that, a lot of things will happen in the background, so which you will learn later at the end as application cycle. We will discuss about that. Initially, I will show you the DOM content loaded event. So how that DOM content loaded event works. So once this is ready, that means it is bundling all the scripts and compiling everything. Because we are working with a single page applications, so only one page is requested, and that is index.html. And from one page, you can access any number of components and use any number of components. So it is generating the application bundles, yes. Yeah. Now once we will launch this page here, observe once we launch this page, let's open localhost, yeah. And some page comes, by default index page comes to us. Now right click, inspect, and here go to the network category, and here, so once refresh the request, and you can see that, so the request came, and at the bottom you can see, DOM content loaded, that is the event. DOM content loaded is the event. And on that event, so you got index.html on the screen. So this is DOM content loaded event. You can see the DOM content loaded event at the bottom, and 1.28 seconds it taken to load the DOM content. So what happened is, this is a static DOM actually, static DOM. You might see that beside DOM content loaded, so load 1.70 and finish 1.83 seconds. Now why there is difference between this? Because so DOM content is loaded, that is actually static DOM, the static DOM. After loading the static DOM, so after loading the static DOM on the DOM content loaded, next step, what happens is, after loading the static DOM, Now comes the process. So the next step, generally what happens is it loads the Angular framework into memory. That means in the next step, Angular, Angular, Angular framework is loaded into memory. Angular framework loads into memory. Angular framework loads into memory. So after the DOM content loaded, the Angular framework loads into memory. That means whatever the library required, it loads into the memory. This Angular framework, what actually it does is, it loads so the main module into memory. The main module into memory. That is app.module.ts. It loads the main module into memory. This app.module.ts, it comprises of information. It comprises of information. You know that it comprises of information of what libraries are required for this particular application. It comprises of information about what the library is required for the application. It imports those libraries. It imports those libraries. And it will include these libraries. It loads these libraries into memory. That means, so this app.module.ts will load all the libraries required for memory for that particular application. After Angular framework is loaded, so this will load, so this app.module.ts, so this will load the required libraries for the application. So required library for application. It loads the required library for application. Whatever library is required for that application, it loads that required library for application. That means it will import and it will load the required library for application. After loading the required library for application, so then what happens is, so it will make use of, with the help of the compiler, so it will take help of the compiler. That means it will take help of the compiler. That means there will be an Angular, so we will call this as an Angular injector. Angular injector comes to action. This is what actually we call dependency injection. We will discuss what is dependency injection in the next stages. We are going to understand about that. So this Angular injector, what it will do is, it will inject all the dependencies and it will load all the dependencies that are required. So these are loaded. That means injector will identify the dependencies. What it will do is, it will identify dependencies for startup component. It will identify the dependencies for startup component. It identifies the dependencies for startup component, and not only identifying the dependencies for startup components, so it will load the dependencies for the components. Let me keep it more shorter. Yeah, it identifies the dependencies for startup component. What are the dependencies required for startup component? And it will load the dependencies. After identifying, loads dependencies. It will load the dependencies, load all the dependencies. Generally, it uses by using a mechanism called DI. DI is dependency injection. By using the dependency injection mechanism, it loads all the dependencies. After loading the dependencies, and identifying the dependencies, that means it will identify the dependencies and loads the dependencies. After loading the dependencies, generally what happens is, now this injector, will take help of, that means after loading the dependencies, this injector is going to, Angular injector, yes, this injector is going to take help of, so a compiler. It is going to take help of a compiler. So it will take help of a compiler. So the compiler is, so it takes help of a compiler. And the compiler that is being used is, so we already know view engines and compilers. So I told you that Ivy is the view engine that is used for rendering and all. These are all internally happening. Just make this as a compiler. So we have a compiler. I already told you 2 compilers are there: just-in-time compiler, AOT compiler, ahead of time compiler. So it uses an ahead of time compiler. By using this compiler, so it will compile it. By using this AOT compiler, it will compile the roots, the component, startup component. That means it will compile startup component. So it will compile the startup component. This compiler compiles the startup component. It will compile the startup component by identifying its dependencies. It gets the information about the startup component library. It compiles the startup component. After compiling the startup component, then this component is rendered. This component is rendered into browser. The component is rendered into browser. So that means the component renders into browser. After compiling the component renders into browser. So when the component renders into browser, so here component renders into browser. When the component renders into the browser, now it is no longer, because it is already compiled through Angular, then it is no longer static DOM. So it converts, after component renders, the static DOM is converted into dynamic DOM now. The static DOM is converted into dynamic DOM. So it is no longer a static DOM. It is converted into dynamic DOM. That means it starts allowing interaction from the user. So the component renders and it converts that static DOM into the dynamic DOM. It converts into the static DOM into dynamic DOM. So this is the basic approach, how it works in the background. This is just a high-level design. That means just an outline high-level design, how your Angular application generally process. So that means in this process, first the client requests the index page, because usually client requests your URL, local host, and 4200. So when client requests this URL, so it requests the index page, and that index page generally loads the static DOM first. After loading the static DOM, so it loads the framework. That will load the app module, so which will load all the required library for application. With the help of injector, it can identify the dependencies required for startup component, and it loads the dependencies, and the compiler compiles the dependencies and required for the startup component, and it renders the startup component into index page. And now the static DOM is converted into dynamic DOM. That is the time, that is the reason you can see here. So DOM content is loaded in 1.28 seconds, but finally everything finished in 1.83 seconds. So finish is nothing but loading the framework, compiling the core component, and loading the startup component into the memory. All will take some time. So once it is loaded, now the static DOM is converted into dynamic. That means now this DOM so starts responding to your interactions. It starts responding to your interactions. So this is the basic outline process, how your Angular application actually works. It's just a high level design, So this is, let me give you this simple design to understand how the process actually works. So this is a basic high level design. Yeah. So this is the Angular application cycle. This is the Angular application cycle. This is the basic application cycle. Now the point is here in this cycle, now the component comes here. So that means in this cycle, the component to be rendered to the client, to the browser. The injector identifies the dependencies for startup component. So Angular injector identifies the dependencies. So so it loads the dependencies. That means Angular injector. So here Angular injector. Yeah, Angular injector. Angular injector. Injector is like a service actually. This Angular injector so loads dependencies. Angular injector loads dependencies. So required for component. Dependencies required for component. After loading the dependencies required for the component. So then the AOT compiles that startup component. Once the Angular injector loads the dependencies required for component, now what happens is the component is loaded. Component is loaded into memory by the AOT compiler. AOT compiler will load the component into memory. Component is loaded into memory by the compiler. So it loads into the memory by the compiler. So after loading into the compiler, now the component instance is created by using component base. We know that every component is created from component base. Component instance is created by using the component base. So component instance is created by using component base. So that already we know. Every component implements the component base. And every component. So every component instance has a life cycle. Every component instance has a life cycle. So that means life cycle indicates. So technically life cycle indicates. So cycle indicates. So various phases of component, various phases of component follows from from start to end. Life cycle indicates various phases of component follows from start to end. That means now this component, the startup component need to be rendered to the index page. Then every component have to undergo several phases. Every component have to undergo several phases. So these are considered as life cycle phases. We call these as component life cycle phases. Component life cycle phases. So generally the life cycle starts usually. So the life cycle starts when Angular instantiates. That means Angular creates the component when Angular creates the component. So the life cycle starts. So after starting the life cycle continues. The life cycle continues with phases like change detection. What are the complete phases? I will tell you. Change detection, content projection, and cleanup. These are the various phases of component cycle. Change detection, content projection, and cleanup. So that means the life cycle actually ends. So the life cycle ends when Angular destroys the component instance. Angular destroys the component instance and removes from DOM. It component finishes using the DOM and it is removed from the DOM. So that means actually the component life cycle usually comprises of component creates, it updates and destroys instances. It will create, update and destroy the instances. So actually all these phases of a component are maintained by a sequence of events by using a set of events. All this component life cycle is maintained. Every phase of component is maintained by a set of events. So these events are controlled by using, you can say that they are controlled with a set of methods known as, so we call them as set of methods known as, we call them as hook method. These methods are called as hook methods. So generally often known as life cycle hooks. Life cycle hooks means technically they are life cycle methods. People call them as life cycle hooks Generally, people call them as life cycle hooks. Actually, they are life cycle methods. Life cycle methods. These methods are used for carrying out various actions in the component cycle. That means from component start to component end, all the activities are managed by these hook methods. So that means these hook methods are responsible for handling. So for handling all interactions of a component. They are responsible for handling all interactions of component. So, and they have a sequence of execution. So they have a sequence of execution. They have a sequence of execution. And what is the sequence of execution? What are the hook methods? And what is the sequence of execution? We need to understand. So technically, so the component cycle starts. So from the injector. From the injector, the component cycle starts. From the injector, component cycle starts. And what happens in the component cycle? That means, remember, all these activities are internally managed. All these activities are internally managed. That means all the hook methods are executed internally. They are all executed internally. All hook methods are executed internally. So that means by default, these methods are functioning. You can write these methods explicitly if you want some additional functionality to perform. That means already these methods are working. That means all the components till now you have used, those components were using these life cycle hooks. Only the point is you haven't seen them explicitly. If you want, you can write them explicitly to define some additional functionalities. That means every component have these life cycle hooks. You are not today writing them specially. They already have them. So only the point you are knowing about them now. So why? Because once you know them, then you can correctly manage the activities as a developer. As a developer, when to assign the value, when to write the custom events, when to execute, when to transport the data, all such activities. So currently we are writing everything in a single class. Everything we are writing in a single class. So in the class directly we are configuring everything. But this is not the right way. So in finally, because when to initialize this data, when to execute this event, and when to collect the data and store the data, all such activities are managed in different phases of component cycle. Now, once developer knows those phases, he will maintain these activities in those phases. Then Angular gives a better performance and handles the interactions correctly. Now it is working fine, no problem. But in real world development process, we recommend to do all these activities as per their hook methods. That means for that we need to first understand what are the hook methods and what they do, and in which hook method I have to write this products collection, in which hook method I have to write the custom event, in which hook method I have to write the general methods. All such things we need to understand. For that, we need to know the hook methods of the component. What are the various hook methods of component and how they work? Let's create one simple table here to understand that. So the basic hook methods, what are the hook methods available? So the hook method and the purpose. So purpose of the hook method. Okay, let's keep this step by step how these hook methods are handled. The first important in the life cycle hooks, component life cycle hooks, the first method that fires up, the first method that executes for every component is ng on changes, ng on changes. So this is the first hook method that fires up. It is the first hook method that fires up. And what happens in this hook method? What happens in the hook method? So in this hook method, what happens is angler sets the value. Angler sets the value. That means it assigns the value. Angler sets the value. You can simply say that angler sets the value into property. So you have declared some properties in a component class. Those properties are defined with values. So values are set into properties. Values are set into properties. Actually, it binds the value to a property, to any property. So after that, what happens is it binds the values. It binds the values to any DOM property, values to any DOM property. That means first the values are assigned to the class properties, and those properties are bind to the DOM properties. DOM properties like value, SRC, and all this. They are assigned to the DOM properties. And generally, if any change happened in the value, so it gets notified with the changes. It gets notified with the changes in values. It gets notified with the changes in values by using an object called simple changes. This I will show you practically. I will show you how these methods will work. So by using simple changes object, that means first the value is set into property. After that, the value binds into DOM property. DOM property means HTML DOM, means it will assign to the DOM. After that, if any change occurred in the value in the DOM, that change is notified to the object by using simple changes. That means I will tell you here. Actually, what happens is, suppose we have the component class. So class, some product. So product. So it extends component. So it is actually extending the component base. In this, we have a property. Generally, we have a property. Into the property, we need a value. So, and this, after defining this, we have input type is equal to text. And here we have a value. So into that, we need to assign that property. We need to configure that property. That means now the point is, whatever value you defined, this value is assigned to this property. The value is assigned to the property, and that property is binded to the DOM property, and any change in the value, it will send back, it will send back to the property, it will send back to the property, it will send back to the property. It will verify the previous value and current value, and it will identify that there are some changes happening in the value, happening in the value. All these activities are maintained on ng on changes. ng on changes, so is the lifecycle hook method. In this, like, it is the first hook method. It is the first hook method. So component starts with ng on changes. Here, first the values are assigned to property. Properties are bound to DOM, and any change in the property in the DOM is updated back to the property in the class. That means actually, so it gets the previous value, it gets the previous and current value, it gets the previous and current value. So, and identifies the changes in the value and report the changes, So actually it includes loading the component and handling any action performed in application. Action performed in application. Action performed in application means it is nothing but event. Any event performed in the application. Event performed in the application. Actually, in this phase only, so it loads both child and parent components. It loads both child and parent components, both parent and child components. So it actually, you can simply say that in this phase, it manages the property and event binding. So in simple terms, you can say that in this phase, it is going to manage two techniques, the property binding and event binding. That means we discussed that in Angular, property binding and event binding will be there. The property binding and event binding usually happens on the ng on changes. That means assigning value to the property, identifying the changes in the value, and updating back to the property. So this is done by using this. That means you might have written some events like button click, on change, and all this. All your events will fire up. All your events will fire up on ng on changes, and it identifies them on ng on changes. So this is the first method that fires up. So what are the activities performed in the first phase? So what are the activities performed in the first phase? So the values are assigned to property. Properties are bound to DOM property. And by using event means actually it uses event. Event is, suppose it can use, so change event. It can use change event. On change event, some change in the value may happen. That value change. So what are those two activities? It is responsible for handling. So one is property binding, and it is responsible for handling event binding. These are the two activities, event binding. These are the two activities performed. These are the two activities performed by the ng on changes. ng on changes is responsible for property binding and event binding. So that is the reason whenever you want to assign a value, whenever you want to write the events, all these need to be written on ng on changes. Practically, I will show you an example how it is going to manage. This is the first phase in the Angular component cycle. That is the first phase in the Angular component cycle. After this, then the second phase comes with ng on init. On init. This is the second one. That means it will be called after the first ng on changes. So it will be called after the first ng on changes. Ng on changes. After the first ng on changes. First ng on changes. So this is the next life cycle method that fires up. Now what happens is, in this what happens is, it initializes the component or the directive after Angular first displays the data bound properties and sets them. That means it is responsible for initializing the memory for transporting data across the components. That means parent components and child components. Memory is initialized to store the values and transport across components. Only initialization of memory is done in this ng on init. That means what happens is, actually, so it will initialize. So it will initialize the directive. It will initialize the directive or component after the Angular first displays the data bound properties. That means some properties need data, properties and sets. Some properties need data. What it will do is, it is going to initialize the memory. It is going to initialize the memory for transporting data across components, and bind to parent and child properties. That means loading the data into memory, keeping the data in memory, and transporting the data from parent component to child component. So binding those data to the properties, the memory data to the properties, all such activities are managed by using this. That means you can simply say that memory is initialized to store values and transport across components. So it is only initialize memory for values. So initialization of memory to store the values so that they can be used across components. That memory initialization is done on ng on init. So that means whatever data is provided to properties, to store the data into properties, memory need to be initialized. That is done by using ng on init. ng on init is responsible for identifying the memory required and initializing the memory. So the first phase is on changes and the second phase is on init. That means after the data is bound to properties, that data should be stored in memory so that this can be carried out across the components and it can be used across the components. For that, we need to initialize the memory, and memory initialization happens by using this phase. It happens in this phase, that is ng on init. So first, the property binding and event binding, ng on changes, then initializing the memory for carrying out the data across the components. After this, now comes the option ng do check. The next life cycle event is ng do check. So this do check is also called, so it is called immediately after ng on changes, or you can say that after every change detection, or you can say after every change detection. It is called after every change detection. So, and it is called after every ng on init. That means after changes, whenever any change occurred, do check will fire up. Whenever initialization happened, do check will fire up. So do check will be firing up on two stages. On changes, do check will fire up. ng on init, do check will fire up. What is the activity done here? What is the activity is nothing but actually it detects the changes. It detects the changes and acts upon the changes. It detects the changes and acts upon the changes. It detects the changes? Already changes are detected at the top. So here what happens is actually, so Angular cannot detect the changes. Angular cannot detect the changes, especially on custom events, because when you write your custom events, it cannot identify the changes. Angular can detect only so the browser events, It cannot detect the changes of custom events. Only browser event related changes it can detect. Then what we have to do is, so that means you can simply say that some changes cannot be detected implicitly. Some changes cannot be detected implicitly. So then ng do check will event is responsible for, that means do check method is responsible for detecting the changes manually. So manually by using we call that as custom events. By using custom events and updates the changes by using, you know that changes are updated by using @input and @output directives, input and output directives. It is also responsible for transporting data between components. Memory is initialized for transporting data in ng on init. After initializing the memory, the data transportation from one component to another component usually happens through custom events. And these custom events are responsible for transporting data from one component to another. So if in interviews, remember, majority of Angular interviews for experienced people, lot of questions are asked related to lifecycle hooks. So if anyone asks like in which phase the custom events will fire up, the custom events will fire up. So because you learned custom events, now if anyone asks like in which phase the custom events will fire up, the custom events will fire up on ng do check. They will fire up on ng do check. What happens in ng do check? the custom events will fire up for transporting data from one component to another. In which phase custom events will fire up? In which phase data is transported from one component to another component, that is do check. In which phase memory is allocated for the transporting data, on init. In which phase the values are assigned, that is on changes. On changes, on init, and ng on and ng do check. This is for handling the custom events. After defining this, now whatever data is present, that data need to be binded to HTML. That data need to be binded to HTML. So data need to be binded to HTML. That is managed by using ng after content init method. ng after content init method. So it is called after ng on init. It is called after ng on init. What it will do is it loads the content into component view. Component view means .html. It loads the content into the component view. So it binds the content into dynamic Angular components. It binds the content into dynamic Angular components. Dynamic Angular components, like we can say ng container. It binds the content into that ng container. So ng container, and we have the options like ng template and all this. That means in this phase the presentation happens. That means whatever data is present, that data is presented into the view by using ng after content init. So that is what actually, so binding of data, presentation of data happens. After configuring the data is presented into HTML, and that is done after content init. So in this, if anyone asks like what is change detection in Angular? So you know the change detection in Angular. Change detection in Angular, so is nothing but, this is what actually we call change detection. Let me highlight the point here. So we discussed that. Usually what is change detection in Angular? When the change detection happens here. So technically change detection is one important point you need to understand. And in this already change detection is happening. Change detection is happening means, so whatever the initial values are there, the initial values are updated with the final values. So that means some changes in the values happened. So, and after the change detection, so this data binding happens. That means if anyone asks what is change detection, so this is what change detection is. That means the first phase is called change detection. That means binding the values, identifying the values, identifying the changes in the values. That means property binding and event binding. This comes under change detection. So in Angular, change detection is nothing but it is a combination of property binding and event binding, right? So technically we call that as change detection, right? Now that I will show you practically how this change detection happens. So we will discuss about that, how change detection happens. Now 4 phases we have seen: on changes, on init, do check, and after content. That means finally data is rendered. Now some more phases are there. So we have some more phases in the cycle. So what are the other phases that we will see in our next session? Tomorrow we will discuss about that, right? So then because some more phases are there, lot of things are there to understand. After understanding all these, I will give one example on this, how to handle this practically. We will see an example for that. So initially What are the phases that we discussed today? On changes, on init, do check, and after content init. What happens? On changes, the values are assigned and the events will fire up. And the memory required is initialized on init. And some values are not updated. So because they are defined through custom events, those custom events will fire up on do check. And finally, the data is rendered on content on init into the HTML. Now, after that, several phases will happen. So what are these phases that we will see in our next session, right? Tomorrow we will discuss about that. Then tomorrow we can create one example to understand these phases practically, right? Tomorrow we'll continue with that.